thousands of things in universities.
So it's my pleasure to introduce John Lynch from Adelaide. He's been a friend of the unit, and then, well, he was a friend of the centre when it was a Centre for Causal Analyses in Translation Epidemiology on our scientific advisory board for a long time. And he's going to tell us how to try to be a more useful epidemiologist. John.
Thank you, George. I was anticipating something much more humiliating in terms of what you're going to say. So I told George that I had nothing worthwhile to say to a bunch of people who sit in one of the best places to do epidemiology in the world. But he convinced me to do something. So this is a bit of a, well, I suppose it is a sort of personal story, but it also relates to this not working.
Oh, man. That's bad news.
Can I go get Marie?
Yeah.
I think it's just, oh, there we go. Oh, we're good now.
Right. Yeah, I fixed it.
So I'm sure because you sit in such a rich intellectual environment, you know who these people are. So that's where Professor Jonathan Stern has walked into the room.
Oh, God, is it you?
Yeah, it's a different bloke.
It's that other fellow.
So this is Jerry Morris and Mervyn. For those of you who don't know, this is a book, Uses of Epidemiology. If you haven't read it, haven't looked at it, you might want to. And Jerry, who I did not know, but George knew well, he was a doctor in World War II, actually served in the field, social epidemiologist, political activist, and got into health services research very early on, and was sort of the founder of physical activity epidemiology with the London Busman study. And he talked about lifecourse epidemiology before it was a thing, and then later advocated for living wages. So this was one of the first epidemiology texts to lay out an approach to preventing chronic disease, now called non-communicable disease. And, you know, George knows much better than me, but it seems to me that what Jerry was trying to do was to show how epidemiology could be used, and hence the title, that it's useful. And it's vastly different to modern epidemiology textbooks. And I love this quote from JCH in 1988, where Jerry wrote a response to when Ken Rothman's book came out, the so-called Bible of modern epidemiology at the time. And I think it's in the 4th edition now. And he said, as a guide to modern epidemiology, the book has serious limitations that the student coming to it afresh could not gather that epidemiology is the basic science of public health. Here's the 7 chapters, the 7 uses of epidemiology: historical study, community diagnosis, etc. And this is Mervyn. This book's now out of print, but it's also a fabulous document. He was from South Africa, left during apartheid, had a big role in establishing community health clinics in South Africa, and was an anti-apartheid activist, and then played a huge role in the HIV/AIDS epidemic, especially in New York. And I think probably the best editor of the American Journal of Public Health when it was in its heyday. And I love this line that he wrote, that we should subject our most cherished hypotheses to the sternest tests. And we see a whole lot of epidemiology that's Me Too confirmatory stuff that is not applying the sternest tests to the things we care about the most. And he wrote this paper in 1991, and he said that epidemiologists have modified causal concepts as the nature of the task has changed, and we should cleave to that approach only as long as it's useful. So he talks about pragmatic epidemiology, but he also talks about being useful. And in there, he says a cause is something that makes a difference. And finding something that makes a difference is actually really tricky. And it certainly does not lie in odds ratios and the size of them. It does not lie in statistical significance. And it's something that epidemiologists need to think about, trying to find effects that make a difference. And that's really hard to define, but it's worth the effort trying to figure out what makes a difference. And something that makes a difference in one field may not be the same metric that you have in another field. So this was an interview you did, I think, George, isn't it, that was recorded in IJE. And Jerry was saying that it's now a very sophisticated discipline, very elaborate, but of course not making the kinds of discoveries that were made in the past. And then we did the easy stuff. I mean, you don't get a disease like coronary heart disease presented to you like this was some gift. But he also, interestingly to me, said major social trends like violence we just haven't contributed to. And I think that's probably changed. Epidemiology has contributed to violence. But it's partly why this thing, well, if you can last till the end, I found myself doing child maltreatment research because it's something that epidemiology had not been involved in, it hadn't explored it. And so I feel like that's the idea of finding something that you can make a useful contribution to as an epidemiologist. So that's why it's from coronary heart disease to child maltreatment. So this is Berkeley, where I did my PhD, and Len Syme was my PhD supervisor, and Berkeley was famous for the social environment and health off this classic John Castle paper from, when's that, 1975, something like that. Many of these things you probably have never read. Most of the things that I put up here, I think, are really worthwhile for epidemiologists to at least have a look at and try to figure out where some of the field came from. So Len was responsible for the Berkeley, the US arm of a thing called the Nihon San study. Nihon meaning Japan and San for San Francisco. And it was comparing coronary heart disease rates in Japanese men who were living in Japan, and then some who were living in Honolulu, and then some who had moved to San Francisco. So this is the classic change in the social environment and understanding why coronary heart disease patterns look so different from these migration studies. And some of you will know that name, Sir Michael Marmot. And Michael Marmot did his PhD with Len on the Nihon San study in 1975. And I was Len's last PhD student in Berkeley in 1995. So if you're into causal inference, it is possible that I caused him to not have any more PhD students, but I'm not sure. I did my PhD on Kuopio, the ischemic heart disease risk factor study. Kuopio was the control city. Some of you might have heard of the North Karelia study, a very famous community-based study in Finland. And the reason they're doing it in Finland is because they had some of the highest heart disease rates in the world. So this was the control study, the KAHD, and they had all this fancy stuff, one of which was B-mode ultrasound. And I waltzed in as a PhD student and got presented with all of this really unique population-based data, and then was able to publish it, partly because it was also novel. And that was George Kaplan, the guy that got me into that. So this is the first paper that I published. This was off my PhD in 1994. And I thought, this game's easy, isn't it? You know, you do your first PhD paper, you go straight into the Lancet. And I thought, no, it's a simple game, isn't it? And then it's all been downhill from there. But this was simply social mobility. They had measures of, and objective measures of childhood condition, and then you had adult social conditions, and then you just run a 3x3 table, and you go, you know, up, down, stay the same, etc., and follow them out for mortality. Pretty simple stuff. And what you find is that the upwardly mobile, so the ones that started out poor but ended up as adults okay, they had the same mortality experience as the ones who were already there all the time. And so this was an understanding of life courses and people's transitions from early childhood conditions to later social conditions. And I actually wrote this, and I think it's probably not bad. So it's good to be able to go back to some of your papers and you go, oh, I'm really embarrassed about what I wrote in that one. But I think this is probably still right, that you don't really understand life course processes until you understand the political and social and historic times within which those life courses occur. So some of you will have heard of developmental origins. That started out as the Barker hypothesis, and this was a big question of the time when I was getting into the game. So this is David Barker, the origins of the fetal origins hypothesis, and he did initially these ecological studies that showed that infant mortality rates were related to coronary heart disease rates. And then out of that, developed these very elaborate biological mechanisms for how this was going to occur. But some idea there was something that was happening in utero that was predisposing to coronary heart disease and other conditions later in life. And so this was the idea, talked about programming. And the programming idea was pretty controversial. You know, the notion that your future state is determined, is programmed by what happens in 9 months in utero. And, you know, there's a fair bit that happens after you're born and then when you die. But this was the idea that somehow you were set on some trajectory. There were people who had lots of antibodies to that, but Barker was a ceaseless defender of the idea. And at that time, you could go into the British Medical Journal. It actually had a whole section, you know, a devoted section to fetal origins. And this is one of the papers that I really like. Nigel Paneth, one of the great perinatal epidemiologists, and Mervyn, who I've talked about. And I love their conclusion that any hypothesis with substantial implications for human health deserves to be examined in a very critical, rigorous way. And that must include a careful search for and willingness to take opportunities to subject the resultant hypothesis to true ordeals. I like that language, that as a scientist, what we're trying to do is we take great beliefs of the things that we study and their importance, but our job as scientists is actually to submit them to the sternest possible tests. We're not just trying to show just another one that confirms things. We'd actually like to dream up a way to test this so that we can say, yep, it really is real. And unfortunately, there's some epidemiology that doesn't do that because we just like our confirmation bias. Matt Gilman, a few years later, says, well, yes, but for most of these epidemiological associations that relate to fetal origins, it's not really clear what the interventions might be to change some of those things. And there are folks sitting in this room who've contributed enormously to that literature. By 2010, it's on the cover of Time magazine. And then we get into this idea. So this is the programming. People responded to that and said, well, hang on, there's things that happen after time in utero. And the idea of life course approaches, life course epidemiology, had been around for a long time. And these are the classic studies of Derrick and Hermack showing these cohort effects, which would be consistent with life course exposures. And then, of course, we get the classic text from 1997 and the second edition in 2004 that Di and Yoav, and I'm sure you all know who Yoav is. They were the editors of that book. And then these two characters even got into the game and did something in the annual reviews of public health. And when I clipped this off the PDF, I noticed this in George's email. I never really asked him what that was about, but you know, I figured that because he's a man of such standing now that the university wouldn't allow him to keep that kind of email address. But it's still there, KZ. And it's about this woman, Clara Zetkin. Maybe you don't, I didn't know who she was. But I found this quote out of the Manchester Guardian from 1901. And he was talking about a speech that 3 women had given. What these ladies do not know in the realm of social politics is not worth knowing. Pretty formidable character, I think. Life course epidemiology is easy. We had perinatal epidemiology, and then we had adult chronic disease epidemiology. The life course epidemiologist links them up with a particular focus on early life exposures. And we had these really elaborate models for what the mechanisms might be. And this was before DAGs, you know, you didn't have to actually have anything causal. You could just write cartoons about how you think the world worked. And of course, anybody now that's up with causal mediation analysis will have a nightmare thinking, how the hell am I going to estimate anything in this? Nevertheless, we love drawing out our cartoon ideas. But the thing about the life course process is it was all about health in adulthood. And so it occurred to me that life course epidemiology takes a lifetime to figure out if you're right or not. And you're probably not going to be around to find that out. And I started thinking, well, what about children now? Because I'd been studying life courses of men in Kuopio in Finland who were born in the 1920s. So conditions in the 1920s for people born in Finland are vastly different to the conditions that children are born into today. And so I thought, well, instead of sitting around pontificating about things that happen over a life course, why don't we think about what's happening to kids now? And then that starts to get you into the whole rhetoric. We've all heard about the first 1,000 days. Have you heard that term? Some people want the first 2,000, some people want the first 5,000, the first 350, whatever it is. But there's some period in here. And some of the things that play into that is the increasing knowledge in neuroscience about neuroplasticity and synaptic pruning, and the importance of very early things under 2 for brain structure and function. And this is literally a cartoon. And I tried to find out where this comes from, where these curves come from. And they come from this guy's work, Huttenlocher. And he did this looking at brains, but he had 21 brains aged 28 weeks to 90 years with 12 data age points. So the data is incredibly, it's incredible work, but it is actually pretty thin, some of the empirical work that underpins those curves. And then we get into toxic stress, and Harvard comes along and they're making videos. So we've got experience builds brain architecture, the idea of serve and return, that you actually engage with kids and the brain responds. And then this thing that everybody talks about now, toxic stress. Some of you may have seen these images from Bruce Perry's work. These become very powerful in the argument around the importance of early investment in children. So these are 3-year-old CT scans, a normal one, and the CT scan of a child in extreme neglect. And Perry went on to write that book, The Boy Who Was Raised by a Dog. And anyway, he tells the story of how some of these kids were in conditions of neglect that you couldn't imagine. Guardian comes along and says, well, hang on, some of this evidence about neuroscience, and we were having a discussion last night with George's son, who talks about, poor people's brains being different. And some of this neuroscience was misused. Here's one of your favourite politicians who's standing outside a council flat in Glasgow, pointing his finger. And Bruce Perry was so upset that the politicians had so distorted his work on what he was trying to do. This is the only randomised trial ever done of foster care. So this is the Romanian orphan study. Some of you may have heard of that. These are children, there are 187 of them, who were under 38 months of age, and they were randomly assigned to either stay in the institutions in Romania or be fostered out. And they were able to show the effect there. And you can see in the graphs comparing the IQs of never institutionalised to the blue were the ones who stayed in the institution. But importantly, they were able to look at by age. And if the kids were fostered out under age 2, they had about, on average, about 10 IQ points higher than kids who were fostered out over 2. So that's this idea that there's stuff going on under 2 and you've got to get to them early. They followed those kids up, and now they're doing functional MRIs on white matter development, and you still see this effect of removal from institutionalization. And these aren't, you know, the conditions these kids were in Romania were pretty terrible. So enter the economists, one of George's collaborators. You have to ask him about that story. Nobel Prize winning economist starts to get into the game, and he thinks this is the greatest social investment that any society can make. And we bring together the worlds of the CT scans and the money, the value of the investment in things like the Allen report. And so you see this idea of the costs that are associated with neglecting children. So how are we doing? Deborah has to leave in 5. I wanted to, child maltreatment made me start to think about how we think socially about children and childhoods. So I dropped in some of this stuff about how we socially construct historically children and childhood. So this is from Australia. These are headlines from The Guardian in Australia about Chloe, who died, and then other kids who died under these conditions of abuse and neglect. You get exactly the same things in the UK. So here we see one from 2021, Polly Curtis, how many more children must die before we fix social services? And how we respond and how we are appalled by the death of young children, especially kids who've been in care. So I tried to go back and I found this book from 1916, an American by George Payne. And the dot points are the kinds of topics in the book, but he describes practices of children and how different cultures historically have treated children. And you probably know that images of child sacrifice have been seen in lots of cultures across the world. And then this guy comes along who I think is kind of interesting. He started the Journal of Psychohistory. I don't know whether you know that, George, but look at the image with the kid inside the basket. I don't know what the hell that means. So this is the history of childhood, and the mouse says the history of childhood is a nightmare from which we have only recently begun to awaken. The further back in history one goes, the lower the, I can't read that, it's just the things in the way.
You're in the way.
I'm in the way. Yeah, I can't move that.
You can move it.
Yeah, there you go. The lower the level of childcare, and the more likely children are to be killed, abandoned, terrorised, and sexually abused. And he came up with this evolution of 6 psychogenic models, with time running along the bottom there. And you can see infanticide being steady all the way across, the abandonment of children. And Empey came along and sort of summarised all of that and said, look, pre-15th century, society was pretty indifferent to children. 15th to 18, they started to discover children. And then in the 19th and 20th century, we're preoccupied with them. And then I came across this wonderful book, Pricing the Priceless Child, from an economic sociologist in the US. And she talks about the transition from the 19th and 20th century that made the child both economically useless because we'd stopped them working. We weren't sticking them in factories anymore, but they became emotionally priceless. It's a really interesting idea about how we value children and how children's value has changed over time. And I just put a couple of things in there. The chapter 1 is called From Mobs to Memorials, the sacralization of child life, the death of a child from resignation to indignation. And we've got value coming in from the economists. This is the famous Heckman curve that talks about the rates of return to preschool, again, getting back to this idea that you've got to go early. But we need to remember that up until about the 18th century, about 50% of children died before they were age 15. It was common. This was a common thing. You were just resolved to that. That's just what happened. And then, of course, we know that things like birth rates went down, mortality went down, population went up, and that's the thing that was called the epidemiological transition. Now we'll look for some context around actual child maltreatment. So German, Greek, and Roman law that underpinned aspects of British common law, and of course that's what we got in Australia, gave fathers rights over children as if they were property to be bought, sold, and disposed of. That was written into law. In Australia, physical punishment remains legally defensible. So reasonable chastisement by a parent or by somebody else, like a teacher, is a defence. It's justified in terms of using reasonable force to discipline or correct the child. So that is still in the statutes in Australia. And this global report on punishment of children from 2019, I'll just highlight that one thing. There's only 58 out of 199 countries in the world have made corporal punishment in the home fully prohibited. And if you look at those, there's lots of them that are Commonwealth countries, including Australia. UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989. Seems a bit late, doesn't it? 1989. And the United States is the only country in the world that's not a signatory to that because they believe it interferes with parenting rights to be able to parent the child as you wish. So parenting was private. What you did as a parent was nobody else's business. So again, we're socially constructing how these things are changing. And this was a really nice paper from Lancet Public Health, I think, last year, looking at long-term trends in child maltreatment in England and Wales. And so you see homicides going down, people being convicted for acts of cruelty to children. But at the same time, you get child protection registrations going up. Children entering care goes up and down because it's always a political question about how many kids you remove and the resources to do that. And interestingly, there's the 4 types of abuse and neglect. So we've got neglect at the top, emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And there's been a lot of work on sexual abuse and the institutional, various institutional reviews into sexual abuse. But it's an interesting mix of things, isn't it, with neglect and abuse. They seem like different things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you separate out deprivation and poverty and neglect with acts of abuse. So this is Dorothy Scott, who's done a lot of stuff in Australia around child maltreatment. And she talks about how societies have constructed different views of child maltreatment in response to social conditions. And those constructions also relate to how visible the problems are. And that's still the case today. And it's reflected in these kinds of things that we see in the paper on a pretty regular basis. So what do we do? You know, we're going to fix the UK social services, or we're going to fix Australia's social services. Does that mean we just remove all the kids? Is that a good thing? And if we did that, where would we put them all? So we've currently got about 94 per 10,000 kids in Australia are in out-of-home care. That's what it's called there. Your rates are a bit lower, but it's hard to tell with the English data because I'm not sure they're exactly comparable with the Australian ones. So we've got 47,000 children in out-of-home care in Australia, and you've got 82,000, over 82,000 in out-of-home care. So what do we do to avoid those deaths? Do we just go in and remove all of the kids that we suspect might be at risk of some bad outcome? So this was a response to 2 child deaths. This is the Premier of the state with the Commissioner, the ex-police commissioner sitting there. So the Premier decided to get tough, and so he sent the cops to the 500 most at-risk families in South Australia. And I've circled down there, all done by the Office of Data Analytics, who predicted these 500 families. And you get the police come knocking on the door. Dorothy talked about the waves of the child rescue movement. So the first one is institutionalisation. You'd be well aware of that. Workhouses had been around in Britain for a long time, and Australia adopted some of these institutional approaches to that. And of course, in Australia, remember, we're all convicts, right? And there were at least 3 children. It's hard to tell exactly, but there are at least 3 children on the first fleet. There's their ages and what they were transported for. So these kids were in a penal form of out-of-home care. And about, of the 160,000 convicts transported to Australia, 25,000 of them were under age 18. And I put this in because George likes things about height. So it's really interesting. You've got the heights there of the UK and Irish-born convicts, and then you've got the heights of some of the kids who were transported, and they're taller, which might mean they might have been, in terms of their height, they might have been better off in those conditions in Australia than the crap that they left here. Worth speculating about. So we had institutions as well. But these institutions were set up to protect society from destitute children running around. You know, you've seen Oliver, right? You've all seen that. That sort of idea that there's all these vagrant and destitute children out there pickpocketing and doing nasty things. So what we need to do is get them into institutions. And here's the Destitute Children's Asylum, Randwick in Sydney. And as far as I can tell, this is the first Royal Commission. 1874. In 1874, they're running royal commissions into what's going on in these institutions. And the little quote there was that these institutions, orphanages, industrial schools, private and religious institutions, were legalised gateways to help. We knew it in 1874. The second wave is the rise of the medical recognition of child maltreatment. So the first description of child maltreatment is Ambrose Tardieu in 1860. And helpfully, colleagues have translated some of his work in a paper. And these are his clinical observations about these children he was seeing and what they looked like, fearfulness, sad look, etc. And then the physical abuse, the signs, the bruising, etc. And this is a part translation of some of his observations, and you can see the list here of 1 to 9 observations and what the child, what he observed in the child. This is the first one I can find in the English language, 1890 in the Lancet, Cruel Neglect of Children, and the yellow bits that I've highlighted there. As may be guessed, the source of all this misery was drink. The mother being hopelessly intemperate and the father either careless or equally hopeless of effecting any change for the better. So it was well recognised that the social conditions that generated these sorts of behaviours in parents, it's still the same. And then comes X-rays, and John Caffey was famous for doing these X-rays of kids. Tardieu was only, he was able to see where bones were broken, but Caffey really put on the map the idea that we've got kids who with documented fractures. And then this is probably the most famous paper from 1962 in JAMA. This is Henry Kemp, the battered child syndrome. And there he is, he's a practicing paediatrician. And interestingly, he talks about that physicians need to become aware that children get abused and they get hurt, and they need to be brought to the authorities' attention, one of which was the Societies for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. So I went back and had a look. This is the dates of establishment of the Societies of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in some different places. So 60 years in the UK between prevention of cruelty to animals and a Society for Cruelty to Children. This is the first case from New York, Mary Ellen Wilson. This was the case that allowed them to establish the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And here you can see her and the scissors that her parents used to beat her, and then later on the other side. And they had to actually use the legislation that had been enacted around the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals to get the legislation up for the children. And the people who had advocated so hard for prevention of cruelty to animals became incredibly important supporters for establishing that society for children. So these were powerful, politically powerful people who had established cruelty for animals, and they threw their weight behind the Cruelty to Children Society. This is the first Australian report from good old University of Adelaide. So these are two paediatricians. George Maxwell was a pretty big figure, and it's a case report, 26 children, 8 of them had died, 2 had permanent brain damage. And they call for model legislation to be considered for protection. So we don't have anything like child protection agencies yet. But in South Australia, that was the call, and that was the same call that Kemp made. So the medical recognition is enormously important. We've got X-rays, we've got paediatricians recognising child maltreatment and abuse and neglect. But maybe it sort of made people think that it was rare. This doesn't happen very much. It's terrible when it happens, but it doesn't happen all that much. Because you can imagine that what you see in the hospital system in maltreatment is a tiny, tiny sliver of what's going on in the community. So then we run into state-run child protection, where you have legislated, in Australia and the UK, we have statutory child protection. That means there are laws that say the end game for statutory child protection is, do I remove the child, yes or no? And the state has the legal right to do that. But that's the idea of statutory child protection. It's not to provide support for families. The idea is, do we take the kid or not? And child protection legislation is constantly being tweaked off the back of these things that hit the newspapers when a child dies. And we're currently going through another redrafting of the child protection legislation in South Australia. So in Australia, it's all jurisdictional. South Australia has their system, New South Wales has theirs, etc. There's no federal system. So since 2004, we've had 34 commissions, inquiries and reviews in Australia. They've been highly critical of child protection systems. We had 10 going on in Australia in 1 year. And in South Australia, the latest one delivered 260 recommendations. So in South Australia in the last 10 years, we have 811 recommendations for reform, some of which are contradictory. 811. Figure out how many that is a year. And still, it's no better. So our question is, do we really want to keep doing this? Do we want to keep going through these cycles of commissions and we generate 200 recommendations and we get 5 years down the track and nothing's changed? And you've had your own reports. So this is from May 2022. This is the independent review. So the parallels between countries is really quite striking. Nobody's fixed this. Nobody's got this right. And in Australia, we throw in racism over the top of that. So this is, these are children receiving child protection services, and you can see for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children by jurisdiction, somewhere between 10 and 11 more times, 10 and 11 times more representation. And you can't talk about that in Australia unless you're willing to talk about stolen generations. So this is when white fellas came along and removed the black kids and took them off to these institutions, and that's what's called the stolen generations. So 33% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population today in Australia, a third of them are connected to the stolen generations. So you can't talk about child protection and child maltreatment in Australia unless you talk about racism within the system. All right, so that's all the setup. I'm going to tell you a little bit about, we're doing all right. This is a platform that I've been building for over a decade, and I'll try to help you understand how it works. So it's a linked administrative data platform, and it's got we've got birth cohorts. So we pick up birth cohorts from birth registrations. We've got about 30 of them starting in 1991, and we can follow these through. And we collect administrative data from the education system. So these are standardised tests, behavioural stuff, all that kind of thing. Social services system. So we get homelessness, we get child protection, public housing, and we also have access to welfare payments. So we're lucky, we're the first in Australia to ever have access to unit record welfare payments, because that's a federal thing. We've got a federated system where states collect data and the feds collect data, and getting them to share data across those things, that's a nightmare. Anyway, we've got that data. And then we also have a stream of work around justice and corrections. So if you think about contact with child protection agencies, and then you think about youth justice, kids can come in as young. What's the age in here? Is it 10? Yeah. So we're 10 to 18. So we're starting to look at, well, what's the child protection history of kids who transition into youth justice? And then, of course, it's no surprise that they transition into the adult correction system. So you've got about 90% of the kids, 90% of the kids in youth justice have had child protection contact. It's almost 1-to-1. And so that's what the linked data enables us to do. So there's about 500,000 kids in there. We can create families, so we've got siblings, etc. And importantly, we've got over 18,000 Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander children. It's a very small segment of the population, so that they don't get visible when you do a survey or when you're running a cohort study. The longitudinal study of Australian children has almost no Indigenous kids in it. So this becomes important in being able to tell their story in the data. What else do I want to tell you? So there's millions and millions and millions of records. So we've got entire populations. And that's the health data that we pick up. Obviously perinatal data plus hospital, ED, community mental health, drug and alcohol, etc. So this thing, we've got just about all the administrative data that South Australia collects on families and children. The child protection one is really important. They did not make child protection data available to researchers because it's just too damn sensitive. And they did not want it out. So we have massive data dumps, the biggest data dump ever out of child protection. We basically have everything they have. And that has evolved over a long time of them trusting us, getting to trust us. I'll show you some of that data in a while. So we can follow kids through the cohorts. I don't need to show you that. And you get that idea. And you also get the idea of thinking about birth cohorts in calendar time, so that you can take a birth cohort like this, we get a birth year, and then you've got to figure out when do we see them at age 5, when do we see them in school, and then when do we see them in the wellbeing survey. And then you've got to figure out how many cohorts can you collapse, etc. So, you know, ALSPAC is one birth cohort, incredibly richly done. We've got 30 of them, but it's very thin information. It's not rich in the same way that something like ALSPAC is. But the other thing we can do is we can still see system views. So that green bar is what happens in a year. So you'll understand that what child protection sees in a year is not the same story as what happens to those kids as they move through time. So we're able to tell a child view and a system view. And we've done lots and lots and lots of reports. So we've pretty much stopped publishing, because publishing is only academics talking to other academics. Nobody else in the world really cares. That's a joke, it's all right. Researchers talk to researchers. We found ourselves talking to government and other agencies. Hence, we do these reports. Every one of these would be a single paper publication, but 90% of them will never see the light of day because they're actually being used. They're cabinet in confidence. They're being held by the government. So that's been a really interesting transition. We span the world of normal research, and sometimes we act more like consultants to government. So these are the agencies we've worked with over the years, pretty much every agency inside the state government of South Australia and some federal ones. Now we're actually negotiating to get tax data in. So we could be the first in Australia to get income tax data, which means you can actually see incomes and you can get a much better handle on poverty. Plus we get census and some other things. So these things take a long, long time to negotiate. But because we built the platform and it works, the feds are interested in showing that they can share data with jurisdictions. So they come to us, we didn't go to them. So they say, come and work with us. So we'll see how that goes if we can pull it off. So unsurprisingly, government doesn't have the necessary analytical skills sometimes to actually use data like epidemiologists do. They don't think like that. So we bring a unique data platform. Government doesn't have all this data linked up. Government data systems sit in silos that don't talk to each other because they're activity-based. As soon as we link the data up, we've got an asset they don't have. So they can come to us and say, we're really worried about these emotionally disturbed young boys. What can you tell us about them? And we can use the data and say, here's how they started out. No, they didn't have low birth weight. And we can tell a story about those kids and they come to us. So we've got a data asset they don't have. And the value of being an epidemiologist is we think differently about how you use data to tell these kinds of population stories. There's 150 slides in this pack. I think we're not going to get through. So I'm going to skip this bit, but I'm making the case for why you need administrative data. You've all heard of adverse childhood experiences, some of you. And how is that collected? How do you collect that data on adverse childhood experiences? I know Laura knows this.
Mainly a retrospective questionnaire in adulthood.
Yeah, so we go to an adult and we say, and we ask questions about how were you maltreated as a child? Yeah. What's the youngest you could ask a child about experiences of maltreatment, do you reckon? How young? 3-year-olds, can they recall that? Would they report it? What's the general rule with asking any kid a questionnaire? So you don't have to get the parent to report, the child reports.
8 to 10.
Most people just say 8 to 10. Yeah. So you really want to go and ask an 8-year-old about experiences of sexual abuse? You want to get that through ethics? So you start to see the problems. So there's a lovely study that they just spent $2 million running one of these studies in Australia. I like this. This is cohort study, Baldwin stuff. So you get a cohort where you actually measure in childhood. So they ask the kids at age 10, and then you follow them up, and then you ask them as an adult. So we go prospectively at 10, what's your experiences of abuse and neglect? And then we ask you as an adult to recall what's your experiences of abuse and neglect. Do you get the design? So prospectively, ask at 10, retrospectively ask the adult about childhood. Crossover, 50-50. So 50% of the ones who say at 10 they were abused no longer say that as an adult. 50% of the ones who say it yes as an adult did not say it as a child. So what are we looking at with that kind of data? Initially, ACEs were invented by Felitti to treat adults who were obese. He needed to know their history so that he could treat them as adults. ACEs are great if you're treating adults because it's part of taking history. But if you want to do prevention, what's the point of knowing that an adult hasn't experienced a childhood trauma? You can't do anything about it to prevent it. So that's why the administrative data matters. Both are necessary, but you can't do prevention with ACEs studies because it's already happened. All right, so some descriptive epidemiology. Like Jerry, first 3 chapters, uses data. So here's the child protection system. We have mandatory reporting, as you do. So if I'm in the health system or a teacher or something, I am required to report when I suspect a child's being maltreated. That comes in from the community. That can be screened in according to different criteria, and they use things like the structured decision-making tool. Then they can decide if they're going to investigate that. Then they can decide if that is a substantiated episode of maltreatment, and then eventually you could remove the child. That's resource constrained all the way down. So the ability to investigate and to do all that is highly resource constrained in all systems. And in the UK, that's where you pick up your data trail down here. You get looked after children and children in need. You have no data on the front end because it's all collected by local authorities. It probably exists somewhere, but I think it would take a lifetime to pull together. Whereas we get everything in the state for the whole population all the way from the front end. So this is what children being notified to child protection looks like. Birth cohorts on the side there. So 26% of children born in 1991, if we follow them through to 18, will be notified at least once. By the time you get to the 2000 birth cohort, we're up to, let me get rid of that. 40% of children being notified. So you just see these rising birth cohort patterns. Now that's stopped working.
So can you talk us through the sorts of things that might be triggering those notifications, just because those percentages seem so high?
When I first saw this, you know what I said? Nah, that's not right. Just wait, it gets worse.
Okay.
And then we can have a chat. No, what would cause rising notifications, do you think? What's going on out there? It's either real, there's more child maltreatment, or it's reporting bias. Not reporting bias. It's changing social constructions. We get more and more concerned when we see children being poorly treated. Do you think that's changed in society? You know, I tried to say it's changed a hell of a lot since the 15th century. We've now got these priceless children, and we're a little less reticent about interfering in what you see. How many of you have seen, a child being smacked in a supermarket? Never? Yeah. You should get out more.
That's over time.
George last went to a supermarket in about 1993.
We'll have to ask his staff what we can't follow all the kids through to 18. So if we take that same 2001 birth cohort, 25% notified by age 10, and then we can get that up to 2007. So you've got 33% of that birth cohort, 2007, 8, notified by age 10. A third of the birth cohort. Now that's a useful number. Sometimes epidemiologists can generate numbers that resonate. So this is a number that has been used over and over again in the political discussions. about what the hell's going on with child protection and child maltreatment. So our Premier now starts everything that he talks about in terms of scale. 1 in 3 children notified. Does that surprise you? Does that seem a lot to you? Yeah. 1 in 3 by age 10. Very well surprised me. I didn't believe it, but it's right. We went back and had another look at it. So that's at least 1 notification. You don't like that? Because notification's messy, isn't it? It's all sorts of surveillance and funny stuff going on. So these are substantiations. That means they've gone through the process of investigation and then they substantiate child maltreatment. So if you do the same thing, about 5% of the cohort has been substantiated by age 10. So if you think about the average primary school class size, 25, 30 kids, 1 in 5 in the average will have been substantiated for some form of child maltreatment. So this is descriptive epidemiology. We're framing the size of the problem. This would have happened when coronary heart disease was happening all through the start of the 20th century with people like Jerry Morris saying, what the hell's going on? Everybody's dying from heart disease. And we need to frame the size of the problem. So we're working on something that epidemiologists haven't looked at. So these are the number of notifications. Over here, you've got in 2019-20, 75,000 notifications involving 39,000 children and 20,000 families. So this is the sort of data we give to them. They can't generate this stuff because they don't know. They count the number of occasions of service, if you like. That's what they can count. They can't turn that into families and children. And the dark blue bars, 70% is return business. They already know about 70% of the ones that will come there next year. So we've got 300,000 children, 0 to 14. If we looked at all the ones, 0 to 14, who've been notified to child protection, there'd be 75,000 of them. Some of you may have been to the Adelaide Oval to watch cricket. 53,000 people fit into that. So you need 1.5. These are the sort of things that the politicians go, whoa. But that's epidemiological thinking about trying to frame sizes of problems. Here's another way to do it. Here's the prevalence from 0 to 14 of child protection notification. And there's a whole bunch of childhood conditions. So if we're comparing it to asthma, a terrible problem for kids, it's 2.5 times bigger than asthma. All right. So I should finish up. Yes, you're asking, do notifications matter? Lots of false positives. So again, the use of the linked data. So these are kids who've had no child protection contact, and then that next bar is the ones who've had just 1 notification. So if you look up here, there's the 21% vulnerability at age 5, 50% for the kids who've been in out-of-home care, substantiated, half of them. But if you go to this group, just one notification, and that's all, they got twice the vulnerability at age 5. It's not just noise. They're not all false positives. There's something going on in terms of the kids' development. So we think we need to use this mandatory reporting and as an early warning system for poor child wellbeing. Okay. I know you've got other things and better things to do. There's a whole bunch of other slides, but I'll come back next year and finish it off. Let me finish with this bit. I talked about neglect a little bit. We've got child abuse and neglect combined into one thing. So this is the social gradient in child abuse and neglect. And I'll show you the answer now. But I was shocked by the connection between reports of child abuse and neglect. I don't know that I've seen social gradients quite as strong as this. So how do you get the poverty bit out of this phenomena of social contact with child protection when you've got 50 to 60% of all of the business of child protection is coming from the most deprived quintile? It's pretty shocking stuff. And I did not expect sexual abuse to be patterned that way. My a priori was that it would be flat. I could see no reason that would be there. but even that was socially patterned. So look, I will finish there. There was lots more to do, but I'll give you some idea of how you kind of, well, you come full circle. And like Jerry said, we haven't contributed to violence. For me and the other epidemiologists I work with, I think we've made major contributions. So these numbers, like 1 in 3, they've never been reported in Australia before. It's a novel finding of good descriptive epidemiology. And we're working our way forward to try to run trials and do quasi-experiments using the data platform to see what we can change. So I'll finish. Any questions? Comments? I thought, Laura, I didn't answer your question, did I?
No, you didn't. I still want to know what triggers a notification.
What triggers it?
Yeah, what's the span of things that can trigger a notification?
So legislation differs in different jurisdictions, but you have to think that there is risk of significant harm, immediate significant.
So it's not like automatic things like an A&E attendance trigger it.
No, there's no recording like that. But if you went to an A&E and the clinical staff thought that child's got funny bruises, then they would report that. But also the neighbour can report it, non-mandatory reporters, where they hear kids being, beaten or something, so they can report it. Yeah.
It's a brilliant talk. I wanted to ask about prevalence of mental illness in your data set, whether you looked at any pattern in terms of change over time in the prevalence.
So we haven't done that trend stuff yet, but we've been trying to understand the depth of complexity of these are kids who are who are notified before they're age 1. So these are the relative differences between kids who are notified before age 1. See you, Jonathan. And the kids who weren't. And you can start to see the relative differences in things like substance use, mental health. Now, this is hospital stuff, so it's serious mental health. These are admissions, and a lot of it is serious mental illness, schizophrenia, domestic and family violence, and intergenerational, because we can see the parents' contact with child protection as well as their children. And the intergenerational transmission is enormous. So that gives you some idea of the complexity. But I think, your question about can we look at some of these trends, putting trends on trends? Yeah, we haven't gone there yet, but of course, that's classic epidemiological thinking, because if the trends are going like this, then that's not necessarily driving it, even though you can look at this in the cross-section and you see these patterns. So there's tons of work that we still need to do to try to unpack that. Yeah.
Thank you. Really good talk. So I'm kind of thinking about, so there might be like a bias so that some ethnicities or like with lower socioeconomic status might be more notified. But have you compared that to the ones that actually are confirmed as well? So if they're the same pattern for the confirmed and the notified in terms of socioeconomic status.
Yeah, it is. It's exactly the same. So as you go through the system, those kinds of social gradients look almost identical. And, notification is a bit soft, but substantiation, that's a big deal. So this involves sort of forensic investigation, and you're then in legal land. So as soon as you have substantiated notification, you're on the edge of losing your kids. So this is serious shit. And you see the same kinds of patterns there. So that part of it looks real, but it's just another example of, people with really complex, difficult lives. They're living in chronic shitty conditions of insecure housing, homelessness, poor mental health, domestic violence, and that's just a constant chronic condition. And then all of a sudden, something will happen. There's a new partner, brings domestic violence into the household, and boom, it spikes up, and there's a report to child protection. So child protection is only seeing these acute events. And if that spike isn't serious enough, it doesn't enter the system. They're screened out because it's not immediate harm or it's not serious enough. So the way we need to think about it is these chronic conditions that are driving these kinds of behaviours, we do nothing to change them. We get a spike, we react to that. In the worst case, we remove the child. And sometimes we don't even work with families to say, how do we get that child back? Is that the right place for a child to be? It's a really difficult call.
So a couple of questions online from Holly Fraser asking, do you have any comments on how social care systems can or do measure the prevalence of emotional abuse and neglect in childhood? I'm interested in how this type of more insidious early life maltreatment may be linked to poor mental health outcomes in later life. Any things that don't, despite the really high levels of reporting that is...
Yeah, I think there are real subtleties in these categories that we don't. How you assess emotional abuse, these things don't, these are all primary allegations or primary substantiations. So they travel together. You don't ever just get one. You'll get a primary type with all the other things behind it. And so the way they classify those things is not probably as sophisticated as the way we do with medical conditions, where you've got a primary diagnosis and secondary diagnosis. But I think it's a really good question to unpack. Can you isolate an effect of emotional abuse from some of these other things? I think it's really hard to do, but it's great to think about that. And we can't overthink these categories either, because sometimes the workers, when they're really concerned about a child, they will actually put a category in there that elevates its risk profile. So they know that a sexual abuse allegation will go ahead of a neglect one at the same age, but they're so worried about this kid and the systems are so resource constrained. So I don't think those diagnostic categories are good enough to be even able to start thinking about pulling them apart. And maybe that's where we need the other kinds of deep dive research that these administrative data just can't handle.
Another one from Monica. Thank you for an incredibly insightful talk. Based on your research, what could be the key intervention that should be implemented to reduce childhood maltreatment?
So we're working on, we're trying to get, there are some charities who are really interested in trying to go at some of the root causes. So what do we do with a young mother who maybe will normally have a young partner, and they deliver the child, and then in the middle of the night, social services, child protection will come in and remove the child. The hospital doesn't know that, parents don't know that, and the child's gone. And they will have some set of risks, but they're homeless. People don't have a home. And then these sort of social conditions keep jumping up. So what's the key intervention? There's not going to be one key thing. There's going to be a whole lot of things. But we're trying to get some trials up around actually providing homes for people. So we work with a charity to see if we can, the charity has homes. They've got 50 of them to give away and allocate them. So we're trying to convince them to say, let's see if we can change the profiles of child protection contact by just giving folks a stable place to live. So it's a really poor answer to your question. I'm sorry for that. I think it's Monica, but I think it's going to be a whole range of things. We've got to try to mitigate the background conditions, and that's going to be across the ideas from poverty to housing to poor mental health. Domestic and family violence is a huge driver. We're going to have interventions that deal with all of that in a sensitive, caring way without the threat of having your kids removed. So somehow that's got to be separated out from the statutory child protection system. And that's why the health system is so important, because it's there to care. That's its job. It's not about removing the kids. So if we can resource up the health sector to be able to help folks find housing, find food, get their kids going to school, do some of those things in the background, then that's the right place for that to happen. Because when social services come in, these folks run a mile. They don't want anything to do with the chance of having the child removed. They're not taking the offers from them. They're gone. So they'll, yeah, long-winded, poor answer. Sorry, Mike.
Anonymous attendee asks, is OVAD still a promising line of research likely to lead to effective NCD intervention?
You want to answer that, George?
Moderately.
Is the idea still right? You know, is it that stuff that happens early in life helps form your trajectory through life? I think that's patently true.
Yeah, I mean,
but I think the question is, for me, and maybe George would agree, that our tools to be able to understand that over long periods of time, there's just too much stuff in the middle to be able to, I think you use the word discipline it in a methodological sense about how you disentangle those things. So, you know, I've sort of copped out and said, I'll go on shorter timeframes. Most of what we do, we're looking at outcomes by age 5. So my vision is to say, can we get these kids who are in such vulnerable circumstances, and the families, it's not just the kids, it's the families as well, but can we get the kids to school undamaged so that they can at least take advantage of the opportunities that education offers? Because when they come in and they're behind, schools are really crap at helping them catch up.
And then the last question is, how do we end the trend? If you've ever worked in the UK social health system, you'll find that after being in care for some years, these children learn to exploit the system. How do we end the cycle?
How do we end the cycle? You know, I wish I had a pat answer to that. I don't think we've got to be working at both ends. We need to do much better for kids who are in care and help them transition out of care. And another piece of the housing story is we're working with, so we just dump kids back out of care and good luck. And they don't have anywhere to live and they have no support. We've got to do that end much better, and we've got to start the prevention stuff. So it's not an either or. We've got to do the tertiary things, the tertiary prevention stuff, as well as the primary, all at once, and somehow stop the intergenerational part of that transmission, because so much of what we see now in the system, I didn't get to those slides, but if you look at kids in out-of-home care today, 60% of their parents were in out-of-home care. So that's a big chunk of a high-risk group. How do we just help those young people not have those kids, or if you're going to have those kids, how do we secure decent lives and decent conditions for them?
Brilliant.
Well, thank you.
Thanks again, John. And
thanks for those. Thanks for the folks online.
And John's around for the afternoon. I know Laura's going to meet with John. If anyone else would like to, then he'll be around, and Marie will know where he is.